Good morning. We are now streaming on Facebook Live as well as Zoom. We have a live audience here, and then good to see you all. We're going to then have potentially some folks coming into the Zoom room, and then potentially folks just viewing on Facebook. And then those of you who are watching this after the live event, welcome to you as well, and glad to have you with us. Dr. Erin Darby is Associate Professor of Early Judaism in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Tennessee and serves as the University of Tennessee Faculty Director of Undergraduate Research and Fellowships. Apropos to today's topic, Erin specializes in the history, archaeology, and literature of ancient Israel and Jordan. Her research at the W.F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem and the American Center of Research in Amman, Jordan, has been supported by several competitive grants and fellowships. She is also the co-director of the Ayn Gharandal Archaeological Project in southern Jordan. And because of all that, that makes you uniquely qualified to deal with the archaeology of David, uncovering David, which I believe is your task for us today. And without any further ado, Erin, over to you.
That's quite a task you've set for me. I would not wish to excite anyone's enthusiasm. We're going to talk about the process of uncovering rather than actually uncover, because I don't want to promise more than I can deliver. This is a really complicated topic. And I just want to make sure I'm clear on the timing here. So we start now and then we go until... Oh, it's hard for me to hear at that distance. Sorry about that.
Um, 11:45.
Okay, all right. I just
so we
like
have about
to
an hour and 15 or so, right?
Great, great. So as we go along, if anybody has any pressing questions and you're in the live audience, grab the microphone and stop me. When I teach, I like to dialogue with my students in the classroom, and that's true in the community as well. So as we proceed, if there are questions you have and you want to stop and talk about them, I am 100% more comfortable with that than just hearing my own voice for the next, say, 30 or 40 minutes. We'll have time for questions, but just feel emboldened that if you have questions or questions come in on Facebook, I don't know if Kelsey's moderating the Facebook account, don't feel shy to stop and ask questions, if that's okay. At least I can see those of you in person. Do I have a head nod? Yes, we're good with that. Yes, excellent. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, which means you're going to have some really boring slides to look at. And I apologize for that, but it will at least keep us, some of them will be super exciting and some of them will be very boring. I'm very sorry, but it'll keep us on track as we proceed. So when I have my screen shared, somebody yell out to let me know it's working. That way I'm not just talking in a vacuum for the next 30 minutes. All right, what do you see?
There we go. We have it.
Are we good? All right.
We don't have it in the slideshow view, though.
I think, let's see, has it arrived yet? I've got a little lag, so it could take a second. Okay.
Yep.
So my job is a hard one, and that's because this period of history is really complicated. There is no one answer to the question that you're posing. There are many answers depending on which archaeologist or which biblical scholar you ask. So we're not going to come up with a definitive answer. We're going to talk about the question, and we'll be successful if you leave knowing why the question is hard to answer. So that's part of our goal. And one of the things I found interesting, actually, when I was putting together the slideshow, I haven't done an image search for King David in quite a long time. And I noticed that so much of the art that portrays David, first of all, portrays him as Caucasian, which is very interesting. A lot of that's Renaissance, early modern art. So there's some interesting conceptions of what an ancient Semitic king living in the Levant might have looked like. But I chose, for the title image, I chose an image by Chagall. But the other thing I found interesting about images or imaginations of David is that so often it's David as a youth. So it's David playing the harp, or David fighting Goliath, or David and Jonathan. These are really predominant images, which is funny because all of that comes from 1 Samuel. And you asked me to talk to you a little bit about 2 Samuel. And I was wondering in my mind why that was. And I think people really like the young David. There's a sense in which our modern imagination of David is he's youthful, he's innocent, he's a man after God's own heart, as 1 Samuel 16 describes him. So that's a dominant image in the art. But today we're moving into David as king in 2 Samuel. And that David is portrayed less frequently as an object of artistic imagination. And I wonder if part of the reason is because 2 Samuel's David is very, very fallible. He's human. He makes lots of mistakes. He has all sorts of problems keeping his family in check. He has consistent issues with the question of who's going to succeed to the throne. 2 Samuel is an interesting book, partly because if I were writing the history of my own family, say the Darby family, I maybe wouldn't have included all of the details that 2 Samuel tells us about David. It doesn't talk about him only as that exalted psalm writer of biblical tradition. It talks about him as a human with very human flaws. So just before we dive into the historical question, I think it's helpful to think about the biblical literature first, and we're going to do a little bit of that in a minute. But as an overall broad book, 2 Samuel tells a really complicated story about this foundational king of Israelite tradition. And that story doesn't spare the details that portray him as human rather than as godlike. And I think that's not an accident. I think part of the push and the pull in the Bible's depiction of kings, I mean, my colleague Ian Wilson at the University of Alberta has an entire book on this. It's really helpful. The challenge in the Bible, in part, is to portray the kings as honorable and important aspects of Israelite tradition without making them look like God. So in contrast, say, with the Pharaoh of Egypt, who is almost a god on earth, or in contrast with the kings of Mesopotamian tradition, or the kings of some of the Bronze Age kingdoms that are north of where Israel is today, their kings after death could be a sort of deity. They could be deified. And so the Bible walks this really precarious line between how do you portray someone like King David as an important and valiant and significant character, while also making it very clear that he's only a human. So 2 Samuel does this dance that I think is really interesting as someone who also studies texts, not just archaeology. All right, so we'll jump in a little bit. And I think what I want to do on the mistake that I think people make, I'll go through what we're going to do, and then I'll tell you the mistake. So the time we spend together will be divided into a few questions or issues. We're going to first start with the text, and in a minute, I'll tell you why. Then we'll think about how archaeologists have brought certain preconceived models to the interpretation of the creation of an Israelite state. We'll talk a little bit about why modern politics and religion make this a emotionally fraught and heavy conversation, why people have very strong feelings about it, and that's a hallmark of this conversation in particular. And then we'll spend some time dealing with the archaeology in the Iron 2A. And that's just a fancy period name for the part of time that hypothetically could maybe correlate with when the Bible describes kings like Saul, David, and Solomon, especially David and Solomon. But we're going to start with the text, not the archaeology, which is maybe counterintuitive since you asked me as an archaeologist, but I'm also fortunately a scholar of the Hebrew Bible. And I think that when we try and bring archaeology and texts together, we end up with a really complex marriage that sometimes ends in divorce or at least annulment. It's not easy to do. And part of the reason it's not easy is because the Bible has on its own a really complex process of coming together. So before we even beg the question of what does archaeology tell us, we should start with the text and ask ourselves, well, what do we know about when this text came together? What do we know, if anything, about the authors? And I'm a historian, right? So my position is not going to be a theological one. I'm not going to be claiming or not claiming that God wrote or didn't write 2 Samuel. I'm interested in what role the human community plays in that process of composition and transmission. So do we know who these people were? Do we know when they lived? And then what are the features of the text that make it hard for historians to go checking to see whether the events described actually happened? You have to do that first, because if you don't start there, you will have very unreasonable and unrealistic expectations of what the text is telling us. So we have to know the material we're working with first. All right, is everyone okay if we start there with the text? Give me a head nod or a yelp or something that seems affirmative. Do you have any questions before we go on? I'm getting waves, that seems good. All right. So when we're asking this question about what some scholars call the United Monarchy, and of course that's a term that is not itself in the Bible. That's a term scholars came up with to talk about passages in the Bible. We're mostly talking about texts in 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and that's where you've spent some of your time, I guess, in terms of where you are in the lectionary or the curriculum. 1 Kings, and that gets us into Solomon. And then 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which were written after 1st and 2nd Kings. And so most scholars think that the author of Chronicles, or the authors of Chronicles, took the account that was already in Kings, added in additional information to it, edited it to make sense within a post-exilic context. So after the Israelites had been sent to Babylon and had come back. So they're not identical. Some passages are word for word similar, and other passages between Kings and Chronicles are different. There's some material in Chronicles that's not in Kings. But these are basically the biblical sources people are talking about when they're talking about the United Monarchy. And you've spent, I think, the most time probably in this case thinking about 1st and 2nd Samuel. So here is where, as a historian, the problem lies. When you go to a Christian bookstore or any kind of bookstore and you buy a Bible, you get this impression that the whole thing just fell down out of heaven in one bound volume. But the truth from a historical perspective is, of course, more complicated. These individual books, as they appear to you now, were actually scrolls. And these scrolls were generated at different times by different sects of the Jewish community for different purposes, and under the influence sometimes of slightly different theological goals. So when you're thinking about the Hebrew Bible, I like to think about it, am I frozen or am I good? Kelsey said I was frozen for a second. How am I? Those of you on Zoom, am I frozen or am I mobile?
Your video is frozen, but your audio is, now you're back on again. You're okay.
Okay, all right, but you can hear me, right?
Yes.
So now I have to remember what I was saying. Oh, so when you're holding a Christian Old Testament, you are holding a library of individual scrolls created at different times, sometimes transmitted together, sometimes not. Early synagogues in the 2nd through 5th centuries, if they had individual scrolls, they maybe wouldn't have had all of them. So there's all these interesting questions about how these texts were passed down. Were they passed down differently in different Jewish communities before they end up in Christian communities? But for your purposes, just remember that from a scholar's perspective, when you're looking at Samuel's, 1st and 2nd Samuel, you're looking at a scroll that was transmitted and written separately from the book of Psalms, for example. So I find that really exciting because it means when I'm looking at a Christian Old Testament, I'm really seeing a polyvalence, a multiplicity of voices and opinions about key theological and historical issues for the Jewish community. I like that. I like it's a big table, it's a big tent, and there are lots of folks there agreeing, disagreeing, and it's still kind of all put into the tent. No one's kicking anybody out of the tent. That makes me happy. So in our case, if we know that these texts were written and transmitted separately with different communities in Judaism over time, we have to ask ourselves, if we're looking at 2 Samuel and the depictions of David and his reign as king, when, who, how, right? There's all these practical questions about who was responsible for putting the text together that you're reading and transmitting it from community to community over time. All right, so what does that lead us to as scholars? It means that that just because 2 Samuel or 1 Samuel or 1 Kings appears as a kind of completed closed book now, doesn't mean that's how it started. So I have to ask really particular questions about sometimes individual chapters and sometimes individual verses. It would be like if, so I'm looking at Margaret, right? Margaret's on the Zoom. If Margaret wrote a paper in one of my classes, and so I have Margaret's original paper, and then as a professor, what if I give Margaret feedback? So I have some comments, maybe I cross out a line here or there and suggest we word it differently. What if Margaret is co-authoring with Pastor Mark? And so how do we know whose words go to which person? What if Margaret wrote it first and then somebody else like Kelsey gets it secondarily, adds her comments to it, changes some things, passes it down to Martha? You see how complicated just figuring out which words go with which author might be? This is the same problem we have in the biblical text. So we have probably just in 2 Samuel, different sources that came together from different places and at different times. We know this because, for example, the poem in 2 Samuel 22 is also in the book of Psalms, chapter 18. They're not identical, there's small changes between them. So what that might tell me as a scholar is that the authors of 2 Samuel perhaps either wrote a poem that later the authors of Psalms borrowed, or that there was this free poem out there about the David's reign and Israel's history that got borrowed one way into 2 Samuel and borrowed a different way into Psalms, which again, as a scholar, I think is super interesting because it tells me there's all these people, all these hands touching the tradition at different points so that you're never alone. You're always reading as part of a community that spans thousands of years, which I think is cool. So when you're talking about different traditions about David in 2 Samuel or 1 Samuel, you don't look at them necessarily as a whole. You might look at, well, what does chapter 9 of 1 Samuel say about Saul versus what does chapter 11 of 1 Samuel say about Saul? Do they agree? Do they differ? I might look at what the story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel is, and I might compare it to stories in 2 Samuel that don't talk about David killing Goliath, but attribute it to someone else entirely. Again, this can feel overwhelming if you've never thought about the Bible that way. So I recognize that, and that's difficult, but I want you to understand how a historian might come to the text. So part of what we're looking for are these sources. Where did the material come from that eventually makes up the corpus that we're interested in? And one of the very long, scary terms here that we use all the time when I'm teaching is the Deuteronomistic Historian, or DH for short. That's his slang name, DH. So the Deuteronomistic history is a collection of these books that span from the book of Joshua all the way through 2 Kings. And it's not that there aren't individual sources that were put together. I just gave you an example of 2 Samuel 22 as one, but that they're edited a certain way. They show a kind of theological concern. And they're called Deuteronomistic because the theology that scholars think they see in that editing is consistent with some passages in Deuteronomy. So the argument goes, whoever put Joshua through 2 Kings together was more or less agreeing with certain theological beliefs that we find in the book of Deuteronomy, and was using that framework to tell the history of the rise and eventually the fall of Israel. So it would be like any of us, if we were telling US history, we would have a framework, we'd have a point, we would be making an argument to an audience. We wouldn't just be giving facts, we might actually be using history to make either a theological argument or a political argument. Humans do this all the time. So this causes all sorts of trouble because some scholars say, well, this happened before the Babylonians destroy southern Judah as a country and exile its population off to Babylon. So that would put us before the 6th century. Other scholars argue, no, all of these books were finalized in the version you have way later. So after the Jews are exiled to Babylon and they're there for several generations, eventually under the Persians, they're allowed to come back. And some scholars say, well, the Deuteronomistic history didn't come together until hundreds of years after the events took place. And now we have a fight, right? So in any given chapter or in any given verse, scholars are saying, all right, so does this reflect the circumstances in the 8th century BCE, or does it reflect people's thoughts and circumstances in the 5th or 6th centuries BCE? That's not a small division of time. So I'll give you a good example, and there's some that are really clear. So in 1 Kings 8, there's a speech that Solomon gives at the dedication of the temple to Yahweh that he's created. And most scholars think that the speech in Solomon's mouth was written much later, already after the exile to Babylon had taken place, and perhaps even after the Jews had returned from exile to Israel. So if we were going to use the speech in Solomon's mouth as a character, would it tell us about the events in the 10th century BCE, or would it really tell us what people in the 6th century, 400 years later, thought about those events? So I know this is complicated, but it's step one, right? Before we even get to, can we find it in the archaeology? We have to ask, in any given text, in any given chapter, in any given verse, when do we think this was written? And does it tell us more about the time period when it was written? Or does it tell us about the events as they claim to have happened? And we see this all the time in the modern world. If you had a movie right now, and the movie was set in the 1950s, but it used, words that were not used in American English until, the 2000s, you'd know that certain depictions in that film reflected the time period of the filmmaker. That doesn't mean everything the filmmaker's telling you about our fictional story in the 1950s was wrong or didn't happen. It just means you've got both. You've got to ask yourself, did our 2010 filmmaker accurately depict what happened in the 1950s? Did he do a pretty good job? But there's some ways in which his own worldview and his own social, political, or economic, or gender, or racial context impacted how he told that story, which is just to say that all humans do this, right? So before we can even get to the question of did it or did it not happen, we have to identify as much as possible when the texts that we're talking about were written, if they were edited later, and if those edits tell us more about the period when the edits were made than they tell us about the period of the events occurring. So that's a long-winded way of explaining why this is hard. There's also lots of genres in Samuel. So we tend to read this as modern Americans as a history, but in fact, it includes sort of mythological kinds of contexts. I don't mean myth in a sense in which it didn't happen. I mean myth in the sense of larger than life. It includes things that are like legends, right? That are about Saul or David or Solomon, and they have a certain power in the same way that some Americans tell stories about, say, George Washington and cutting down the cherry tree, right? That story tells you something hypothetically about America's, I don't know, commitment to honesty, depending on who you're asking. But do you really need George Washington to have cut down an actual cherry tree? Do you need to know where the cherry tree was? How many cherries were on the tree? What if George Washington never lied about cutting down a cherry tree or didn't, right? What if there was no cherry tree? Does it change the value of the legend? So part of what we have in biblical literature, including in 2 Samuel, are these stories that are legendary in scope. Some of it probably depicts events that actually happened. We just have to figure out where those events are in all of the layers of text and meaning. It certainly is a theology. So it's laying out a story about how Israel's relationship with God worked in the author's opinions, whether or not that went well, whether it didn't go well. In some cases, if you've got editors writing after the Babylonian exile, when there is no king in Israel, think about how interesting that is. What if I'm writing in the 6th century when I don't have a king at all, where the people who have the most power are priests working with the Persian government, and I'm telling you the story of Israel's kingship? How might that impact the way I told you that story, especially if I'm a priest who now has some of the power the king used to have? So there's a theology here about whether or not why Israel rose to prominence, why it fell, why the Babylonians eventually were allowed to destroy the city from that perspective, from the ancient world, right? All things are enabled by the gods. There's no sense in which things just happen that the gods don't allow. So they have to explain how the gods, or in this case, God, could allow something like the destruction of Jerusalem to eventually occur. So there's all this theology happening in there. And it's a compilation of different texts. So you've got poems that were probably independently written, put in there. You've got all sorts of stories, and I'll give you an explanation in a second. The texts give you a schematic presentation of history and time. So Saul reigns for 40 years, David reigns for 40 years, Solomon reigns for 40 years, Moses is wandering in the desert for 40 years. Does this mean that on the evening of the 39th year, that's it? Probably not. 40 years becomes a symbol for about a generation. And given life expectancy in the ancient world, 40 years is not bad, especially if you're a woman and you make it that long. So there are ways in which the biblical authors are using symbols that we may not pick up on right away. There are terms that we don't know how to translate, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. So there's terms like the Milo that David is somehow we'll come back to that, responsible for. What does that mean? Is there an archaeological correlate? Let's just say we build a palace, right? It uses the term hechal. How big is that, right? Does that just mean it's the house of an important person, or does that imply that it's a really big structure? Does it imply it's a fancy structure? What does it mean to build, right? Does it just mean I made a minor renovation? Does it mean I changed my living room? Or does build mean I made a whole new thing? Does it mean I fortified the walls, or does it mean I made new walls? These are silly questions, but ultimately become a real challenge for historians, because if we don't know the answers, how do we know what to look for, right? That's part of the problem. We've got folk stories in 2 Samuel, things that a historian could not know, conversations that hypothetically, in the logic of the story, happened in private. So, for example, the dialogue between David and Jonathan in 1 Samuel, when David's worried he has to flee and Jonathan has to shoot the arrow to let him know. Hypothetically, the only people in the story who were there are David, Jonathan, and a servant boy. So how could a court historian know what was said? Another good example is this palace intrigue story between the prophet Nathan and Bathsheba about who's going to succeed David to the throne. And this is at the end of 2 Samuel and the beginning of 1 Kings. This is supposed to be a private conversation that yet somehow the author of the text had access to. Well, how? Were they listening? Were they hiding behind a wall? Did Bathsheba tell them later? So there's all of these sort of folk stories that in the logic of the text, the author couldn't have been there to hear. They're not verifiable one way or the other. So those are features of 2 Samuel as well as 1 Samuel. And then there's all sorts of integrations of conflicting accounts or duplications. So I already gave you the example that in 1 Samuel, the story of David and Goliath. David kills Goliath. In 2 Samuel, someone else is attributed with killing Goliath. It's in this little note later in the book. Another good example is in 1 Samuel, Saul has the problem of the spirit that Yahweh sends, who's evil, who's plaguing him. So Saul goes and gets David to play the harp. But then a chapter later, David shows up to help the Israelites in the battle against the Philistines, and Saul doesn't know who David is. But he just hired David one chapter ago to play the harp for him. So there's weird, like multiple versions of how Saul and David meet. There are other examples where the same actions happen twice. So in the end of 1 Samuel, there's two different stories in chapters 24 and in chapter 26 of David and Saul meeting in the wilderness and David cutting pieces of the robe and getting away when Saul's trying to kill him. So there's all sorts of material like that in 1 and 2 Samuel, where you've got either slightly different accounts of the same story or duplicated accounts in different chapters, which tells us that it's not so simple as I'm going to go out in the field with a Bible and I'm going to just dig this up, right? That would mean that I didn't have a lot of respect for the biblical text. But as a scholar of the Bible, I spend a lot of time thinking about just the text by itself, which makes it more complicated to correlate with the archaeology. So before we move on, does anyone have any questions about how 1 and 2 Samuel are complicated, or why it would be difficult to assess whether or not the events happened, or anything about the texts themselves?
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. When you mentioned the challenges, my first thought is sometimes God is communicating to the person that eventually is the author, and that is how the author knows what to write.
What happened, right?
Without being there, or it was the servant boy who then passed the story. Thank you.
And that's a really common theological explanation for that. So you're in good company. Lots of Jewish and Christian authors throughout time have dealt with that issue in very much the same way. The difference is that as a university professor, I'm approaching this from the perspective of a historian rather than a theologian. So for me to stand up in a classroom and say, well, it's because God spoke to David, then I would be essentially arguing for the existence of God, which is something that in a state university classroom, I'm not ever supposed to do. You don't support the practice of one religion, you don't impede the practice of other religions. So part of my answer to the question is because of who I am and what my profession is. So what I tell my students is, I pose it as a question, and that's a question you could answer lots of different ways. It's just, generally speaking, in my job, I would never want to make a student uncomfortable by using a theological answer to explain a historical problem, because it would depend on things I can't prove, right? And it would actually violate sort of what I'm allowed to do in the classroom. But in tradition, so Jewish and Christian tradition, is one prominent way people have tried to explain how the authors could know those stories. Any other questions?
When you have in two chapters, say, two different accounts, two different stories,
Right.
why do you think the authors decided it was important to have two versions, right, by each other? Because obviously an editor could have come along and said, no, let's
Right.
tidy this up. But they didn't. They said, no, it's important to have these two stories.
I love that question because it's an active question in scholarship today, and it would depend on the stories. So I would answer that differently depending on which thing I was looking at. So the short answer is, we're guessing, right? I don't get to talk to the authors. So there's no one there to tell me one way or the other. I can make a hypothesis, but it's always going to be a hypothesis, right? So sometimes it seems that maybe they wanted multiple perspectives on the same event. A good example of that is in a different book. There are two different creation accounts, one in Genesis chapter 1 and one in Genesis chapter 2. Well, why put two of them right next to each other that differ in some significant ways? Well, an argument might be that they wanted multiple perspectives or approaches, that they felt that the two versions told slightly different things about the relationship to the divine and the community. So in this case, in the case of 1st and 2nd Samuel, there are plenty of these duplications and people don't always know why they're both in there. So I don't have a great answer. I do, however, celebrate that they're in there, right? I think that's such a different choice than I, as a modern editor, would have made. And so I think I think a lot about how in the biblical corpus, material came together and wasn't forced into one way of telling the story, but allowed for differences and modifications. And I often wonder to myself what we as modern folks could learn from that impulse, right? That you don't have to close down the conversation, that you could have the conversation and it's all in there. So I don't know how to solve it, but I really like that they did it.
Another question that I have, or to hold up an issue. Well, first of all, to your point, it gives a certain humility to the editor, doesn't it? That who am I to say that this was there,
Right.
this is here, it's all part of the tradition. Who am I to take one out? Why do I take this one out versus the other one, right? So there's that. But the other question I have is a few weeks ago we had Robert Alter, who of course argues for the unity of the text because of his position as a literary critic, right? Of looking at the text as received.
Right.
What you're doing as an archaeologist is you're doing archaeology of the text before you go
That's
to
right.
archaeology of the in situ, right? So both are necessary, right? We can't just have Robert Alter's unitive approach. We also need to have the source critical approach as well.
And I think it depends on which hat I'm wearing. So I also teach a class that goes from late biblical literature through the Talmud. And there we talk a lot about how Jewish and Christian communities interpret the text, how those meanings change and shift over time. So I think it just depends on, at any given moment, what the question is we're asking. If we ask the historical question, what was going on in year 901 BCE, then we have to deal with this excavating the text, as you put it. If I ask a different question, which is in the exilic period, how did people responsible for editing the final volume or the collection of Hebrew scriptures imagine the role of kings in 1st and 2nd Samuel, then it doesn't matter whether it happened in the 10th century. I'm more interested in how people were thinking or receiving it or tweaking it in the 6th century. So I think the question takes us, right? Uses our tools in different ways. So moving forward, are we ready to look at some other problems? Okay, I've got some nods. So let's just, and this is a little complicated, so I'm going to try and go through it as straightforward as I can. There were some historical problems with the way the biblical text describes the rise of Israelite society. And part of this is related to things earlier than the material we're talking about, but I just wanted to give you a sense of why this was a question that came up in scholarship. So the first question is, how do we get from this complete collapse that happens in the late Bronze period all over the Mediterranean and the Middle East to the states of Israel in the north and Judah in the south? And this would correspond to events that you might read about in 2 Kings. The reason that this became a problem is because we have really good data for what was going on in the late Bronze period, and we have really good data for what's happening in the 8th century, but our data for how to get from one to the other is actually pretty messy. And so the data that was coming out of the ground didn't necessarily corroborate the stories and interpretations in the biblical text, which meant that scholars felt they had to explain how we connect these 2 points on the timeline if the Bible isn't giving us all the information that we might need to do that. So there's all sorts of things going on in this collections library that is the Christian Old Testament. For example, Joshua and Judges, these 2 books, give different explanations for how Israelites emerge in the land of Canaan. They don't tell the same version of the story. It's slightly different, and I don't want to get bogged down, but if you have questions, we can talk about that. In the archaeology of Egypt and the Sinai and southern Israel and Jordan, what people found was that the version of the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt through the Exodus and traveling in the wilderness through southern Israel and Jordan and crossing into Canaan wasn't very well corroborated by the excavated data that was accumulating in the first 2/3 of the 20th century, especially. So scholars felt that, that somehow we ended up with these 2 states, northern Israel and Judah. But if we couldn't necessarily buy everything the Bible explains about how that happened, then how, as a historian, apart from the Bible or in conversation with the Bible, would I explain that phenomenon? So this is sort of the story that scholars came up with. That Israel as a community, and whether or not you want to talk about it as a political entity is depends on who you read, but Israel as some sort of identifying body emerges really in the archaeology of the highlands that's around Jerusalem in modern day Israel in the Iron One. So we're looking at closer like the 12th and 11th centuries. And that it was a tribal society. Now that's partly related to the Bible, right? Because the Bible portrays the genesis of Israel as being these 12 tribes that work together sometimes and not other times. And the book of Judges describes them as aligning when needs require it, but that they're not a political nation yet. So some scholars take Judges more seriously than others, but most scholars argued that before we have any kind of political state, there was some kind of ethnic or corporate identity that was thinking of itself as Israel already, in the 11th century. There's lots of reasons for that, and I didn't want to get too bogged down, but I wanted you to get the trajectory here. So then if that were true, the main question becomes, well, if you have these little hamlets, these small villages dotting the Galilee and the hills around Jerusalem and the Iron One, but maybe they're not all politically united, how do we go from that to a nation? What's the process look like? And so the scholarship was drawing heavily on theories of state formation. And this is just the question of how do political states form, right? And there's all sorts of different answers depending on whose theory you're reading. So for a lot of scholarship, they had to posit, well, why would you have a state form? If you've got a sort of loose tribal confederacy or structure of people who sometimes collaborate and sometimes don't, and they're in individual villages and towns, what would be the impetus for leading them to greater political cooperation? And there are a few answers to that, again, theoretical, depending on who you ask. Some have argued that these small villages grew in population such that they needed more space. And according to both the Bible and archaeology, there are another group of people called the Philistines were basically occupying major city areas that were on the border of this kind of proto-state. And so as Israel, or whatever they were, proto-Israel, became more populated, they had to unite because they were coming into conflict with other fledgling states around their borders, but there was this need to grow into more space. Other people have argued that not just the conflict with others, but the interactions and cooperations with these other states also could have led to greater political collaboration. So that's the big story. And it doesn't draw entirely on the Bible. And depending on who you read, it may not draw much on the Bible at all. For other scholars, they try and meld this story with the biblical depictions of the Israelites. But it gets really thorny really fast. And so I don't want to take us too far down the alley. I just felt you needed to have an understanding of how we got to the question we're about to talk about. And it is because we do have, however you want to deal with the problem, we don't have great data that corroborates the Bible's depiction of Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, or Joshua. Maybe closer to some stories in Judges, maybe, depending on who you ask. And so this is a struggle, because the question becomes, if you don't have these data, does that mean the biblical story didn't happen? Does it mean that, in what I like to tell my students, is that texts are produced and written and told and reiterated for lots of reasons beyond just marking a timeline? And are some of these stories influenced by the theologies and the relationships people were trying to navigate and the arguments they were making about Israel's place in the world or the role of Israel's God? So there's lots to say here, but this is just to get us to the question of what's going on during the time when hypothetically Saul, David, and Solomon are on the throne. So before we move forward, anything you want to ask about this kind of historical trajectory or this model scholars have been struggling with leading up to our time period? All right, well, we can come back to that. So I just wanted to double check before we go. And finally, the question that we'll come back to at the end is, how would this look in the archaeological record? So part of our problem, I've already told you, is what do we go looking for? And does the level of organization or political complexity, does it have artifacts or buildings or some kind of material that would be evidence of it? And more importantly, is the absence of that evidence of that absence? So that's an important proposition in archaeology. Just because you didn't find something, does that mean that the thing didn't exist, right? You could dig my house and you could never come up with an artifact that had anything to do with music. That doesn't mean that I don't have a music degree. It just means you didn't dig in the right room. Everyone see what I'm talking about there? So that's an important proposition in archaeology. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. But it does mean that as an archaeologist, if I don't have evidence for something, I need to be honest with you. I need to say, I don't have evidence that supports that having happened, which is different fundamentally than saying the thing didn't happen. It's a nuance, but I think it matters in talking to people and engaging with people from different perspectives. All right, so the other reason this is a really complicated conversation is because people who have scholarly opinions also have both political and religious approaches to the question that make this very emotionally heavy. So whether or not David or Solomon ruled over the period that people interpret the Bible describing in the land has been used in all sorts of modern discussions about the Israeli state in the modern state of Israel. So I'm not here to talk about politics, but I am here to remind you that sometimes people's scholarly opinions or approaches, or religious even approaches to the text, are also influenced by their political approach to some of these modern questions. And you just have to know that going in, because sometimes when you're engaging with somebody and you're not sure where the emotion comes from, it maybe doesn't come from the text. It might come from their own lived experiences or the way a text is being used in the modern setting. And that's not unique to Israel. So archaeology in particular is political everywhere in the world. At its base, I can't just dig something. I need permission from a government to dig. So that means that digging is political, whether it's in Jordan or Israel or India or Afghanistan or anywhere else in America, right? So how we dig, what we do with our information, what the people we work with in those countries do with our information, all of that is essentially political, whether we like it or not. And secondarily, people who have different approaches to the biblical text, right? If they believe that the biblical text needs to, for religious reasons, depict everything exactly as it happened, then they're going to have strong opinions and feelings about saying, well, maybe David's stories are stories and not history. So just realize that these questions are heavy. They're what I call manage with care texts when I'm talking to my students. And people have very strong opinions about them. So let's talk a little bit now about the archaeology. So the original approach to this, I'm going to try not to get uber technical here. The original approach to the question of how do we go from tribes in, small villages to a state structure, saw that this period of years from about 1000 to 925 was more or less the same as the Bible's description of the reigns of David and Solomon. So if you were going to match them up, and when you're digging a tell is just an archaeological mound, right? It's made by successive layers of human occupation. And when some layer is abandoned, then people come back to the same area because what made the area valuable is still valuable. It's access to water, it's command over the environment, so you can see people coming from a distance. So you have these layers of humans reoccupying the same space, and they build up vertically over time. So you can go to a tell, we'll look at one in a second, and say, all right, well, this layer is the late bronze period, and this layer is the Iron 1, and this layer is the Iron 2. And part of your job is to figure out what those dates are for each of those successive layers. Now, it's much more complicated than that in practice, but that's the kind of abstract notion. Scholars? Yeah.
You were talking about the politics of archaeology and getting permission to go in. When you do go in, who do the artifacts belong to?
So now they belong to the place where they were excavated. So in Jordan, where I'm digging currently, I work with the Department of Antiquities of Jordan. If anything that we excavate from the ground, we have to have permission explicitly to even hold it in the country or to take it out of the country. But that didn't used to be true. In the early part of the 20th century, you had all of these Western universities and museums showing up and just taking things. And for a while, the rule was you divided it down to half. You got half and the country got half. And even earlier, during the period of the Ottoman Empire, you just could take whatever you wanted as long as they said, okay. That's how the Elgin marbles ended up in the British Museum. That's how a lot of stuff ended up in the British Museum, for that matter. So that is not how we do it now. But it is unfortunately a very, I find, Black colonialist past to the way archaeology has operated in this region. All right, so part of what archaeologists thought they'd do is they just look for that layer that corresponded to the reigns of David and Solomon. And they came up with this range of dates that they thought did that. And so hypothetically, anywhere you dug in Israel, if you could get that layer, you might attribute that to the biblical stories or the biblical period of David and Solomon's reign. And this was very popular in the first half of the 20th century in particular. So you've got a bunch of like scary state plans here on your right-hand side of the screen. Everyone can see those, a bunch of, looks like squares, with some stones. So I apologize for that. So it's just a good example of what happened. There was a very important Israeli archaeologist. His name was Yigal Yadin. And Yadin noticed that these are gates. So this would be your entryway into the city, right? You come in, I'm here at Megiddo, I'd come in here, and there'd be these chambers on either side for different kinds of activities to happen. So Yadin said, well, if these three sites, Gezer, Hatzor, and Megiddo, all have similar stylistic features for their city gates, and we have this passage in 1 Kings that talks about Solomon fortifying these very cities, couldn't we just say that anytime we have this layer and this type of thing, it's evidence that Solomon built it? And so it looked on the surface like a really easy way of correlating stuff the Bible described and stuff that we excavated. And you now know from this point in the talk that nothing is ever easy. So that's somewhat of, it was a little misleading. It seemed true, but it's more complicated than that. So what we used to do is go around looking for that level, and then we would attribute that stuff based not on the site, but based on the Bible. So nowhere at Megiddo is there a little sign that says, Solomon built this, right? There's no inscriptions at the site that tell you that. It's based entirely on taking something you excavated and interpreting it through the lens of, in this case, 1 Kings. So then there were some challenges with this theory. And the criticism essentially was, we've got the dates wrong. And there's a very complicated reason for this. I don't know that anyone really needs to hear. We got the dates wrong. So this is associated with a scholar named Israel Finkelstein at Tel Aviv University. And his argument was, you're dating these layers too early. They're actually like later. And that means that anything that you went through, that layer, you went through and you said, well, this is related to Solomon. He says, no. It's like 100 years later, and it's related to Omri, the first king of northern Israel. So in Israel Finkelstein's argument, in a kind of a flash, all of these sites that up until that point were proof that Solomon reigned, and that some of the things that describe Solomon's reign in the Bible happened, turned into proof that that wicked king, according to the Bible, Ahab, his father Omri, actually built them. And that it's not evidence of Solomon's reign over all of Israel. It's evidence of the rise of the northern Israelite state under the reign of Omri and eventually Ahab and Jezebel. So people had some feelings about this for all of the reasons we talked about. Some of them scholarly, some of them political, some of them religious. There were lots of feelings. And this became a huge 20-year fight in scholarship, which is ongoing even today. Now, they weren't saying that there was no community presided over by David or Solomon at all. They're just saying that the Bible maybe was it was hyperbole. It was exaggerating how much control David or Solomon had, because the authors were creating a kind of legendary past for the state. And they wanted to make the case that at some point in history, the state extended all the way from a site called Dan in the north of Israel, all the way to Beersheba in the south, which is not true in the book of 2 Kings. You've got two different states in the same area. All right, so they weren't saying that David didn't exist at all. And part of the reason is because of this inscription, which was found in a later context. You don't need to read all this business, but it refers to the house of David. Now, that doesn't say that everything ever written about David in the Bible happened. It just means that a text from outside the Bible, in this case, it's a celebration of a victory over Israel, refers to, or an Israelite victory with Hazael, who's a Syrian commander. So Hazael is commemorating this. It just refers to somebody outside of the Bible knowing that a house of David existed. So that's really great, right? As a scholar, that's what I want. As a historian, I want multiple pieces of information from different perspectives and different contexts that I can bring into conversation. So the one side was still this, well, no, all of these finds support what the Bible says about David and Solomon, and that there was one Israelite state that extended this whole geography. And the other side said, well, that's not true. A lot of the evidence you used isn't affiliated with that time period at all. And it's proof for the rise of this smaller, northern, very powerful kingdom that eventually is under Ahab in 1 Kings. So we have a fight. And by the way, I'm just showing you this so you can see where that inscription came from. So I just think it's important to see the site. So this is the site of Tel Dan, and that's that very important inscription. Mostly it's a Middle Bronze site, so it's earlier than the period we're talking about. But there's a really, anyway, just so you have a sense of the size. So then what do? You've got these two sides, they're fighting against each other. So one side said, okay, maybe you've got a point in a certain way. So what somebody whose name is Amahai Mazar, what Mazar said was, all right, the problem isn't that we were off by that many years, it's that the period, the Iron 2A, that level we've been talking about, is longer than we thought. So that it begins around the time of David's reign, but continues all the way until through the reign of Ahab. So Ahab, like Ahab and Jezebel Ahab, right? The problem, of course, is that even if you say, all right, we have the right level, you still have to ask yourself, okay, but within that level, does this structure date to the time of Solomon or to the time of Ahab or Omri? So it didn't solve the problem necessarily, but it was a sort of moderating or mediating position. So what that means is we're still fighting about it. And carbon dates became really important. So one set of excavations would have one set of carbon dates, and this set of excavations would have a different set of carbon dates, and they're fighting over whether or not these buildings are attributed to which biblical kings in which sections of the Bible. The problem with carbon dates is they have a plus or minus error range of about 50 years, which means that even if I came out and said, oh no, I did a carbon date in this structure and it says that it's the early 10th century, so it's David, someone else could say, yeah, but carbon dating has this margin of error, so maybe you're wrong, right? Maybe that the carbon dates actually are 50 years later, and it doesn't have anything to do with David or Solomon. So it didn't really fix the problem, and the problem is ongoing. Another issue that we have, so this led to different groups of people dating different sites to different kings. And I'll just show you some examples of that without getting too weedy. So this is the site of Hatzor. This is all the way up here in the northern part of Israel. And there's the gate at Hatzor we were talking about. Originally, they thought that there was a large public structure that they associated with a description of King Solomon's stables at the site, but other people said, no, that's the wrong date and that's not a stable. So there was a lot of creativity in the interpretation of remains, trying to match them with the Bible, and subsequent archaeologists have tried to make that less overt. So this one here is Gezer. That's that gate yet again. And this is lower down, this is sort of in the middle of Israel. And here is Megiddo, very important tell site. Also has one of those gates. Oh, I'm sorry, when I was talking about Solomon's stables, I meant to be talking about Megiddo, not Hatzor. So ultimately what this meant is that you have two different teams of archaeologists. We'll come back to this one in a second. Two different sides of the debate, and they are interpreting the same remains in different ways and fighting over the carbon dates about who it's associated with. And this is a site all the way in the south of Israel, all the way down by the Red Sea, where some archaeologists say this is evidence of Solomon owning mines in First Kings. And other archaeologists say, no, the date of that's totally wrong. It's either earlier, mostly people saying it's earlier than that. All right, so I'm not gonna solve that problem for us today. Whether or not Megiddo's public building is or isn't Solomon's stables, whether or not it is associated with Solomon or Omri, that's not something I can fix for us. I think we can think more creatively about whether or not we need to associate a one-to-one piece between all sites in the Bible, but I wanted you to have a sense of where some of the fighting is. So then people started digging different sites. So Tel Aviv University, where Israel Finkelstein is, was arguing that these sites are later, and Hebrew University, where Finkel and Yigal Yadin used to be, were arguing that they were Solomonic or Davidic, and they're wandering around, they're digging different sites in the country. And so part of the problem had been dating some of these areas. So do we have the information, if we're digging this layer, do we have the information we need to know when the layer occurred? And so all I want to point out here is that not necessarily. And even if the layers are, say, the early 10th century, does that prove that what the Bible wrote about David and Solomon happened? And sometimes we get a little wild. So for example, digging here at the site called Kirbet Kiafa, the archaeologist created a pottery chronology. So that just means we can use the pottery to date when a layer was deposited, at least by the period by which it was deposited. And has that impacted the discussion? Do we now have more ways of dating the early 10th through late 10th century? Maybe. Does that prove that David or Solomon built the site, or that everything about the site proves that what the Bible says about David or Solomon existed. No, that's a more complicated argument. But yet sometimes we get a little bit creative. So they found one of these at the site. This is just a typical shrine box. We have them all over Israel in the Iron 2A. It's a sort of model naos or entryway to the shrine, and then it's usually an empty box behind, and there'll be pillars in the front. What these functioned to do is still unclear. So this is part of my expertise, is the cultic artifacts of ancient Israel. But the excavator found this, which is not a surprise in this period, and said, oh, it's an example of Solomon's temple because there's no depictions of humans or animals. Well, that's just not an argument you can make, right? What the excavator was doing was using the Bible's understanding of Solomon to try and interpret an artifact. But there's nothing in this artifact that is in any way connected to the Bible's description of Solomon's temple. It's a stretch, right? It's a stretch because you're using the Bible too heavily to interpret the material culture. So that's just an example of, even if we are making progress in some ways, we're not always making progress in other ways. So ultimately, and this is a really hard question to answer, let's say we have all these sites. Let's give them the credit and say, okay, all these sites date to the early 10th or mid 10th century. Does that mean we have a state? What is the difference between a state and individual cities that are gaining in prominence or power in the area? And a lot of people, that comes down to Jerusalem. So in the Bible, in 2 Samuel 5, is the story of David conquering Jerusalem and making it his capital city over his kingdom. The problem is, as someone who works a lot in Jerusalem, we don't have good information or architecture that dates to the period that we've just been talking about. So prior to the last several years, the only structure we really had is this crazy, what we call a stepped stone structure. Some people connect this with that term Milo I showed you earlier. We didn't know what it meant. That's attributed to David. So the date of this big structure is in debate. All of this down here is later. So this would be the time when Judah is its own country. But there's an argument about whether or not, or how early this thing dates to. So this was the only stuff in all of Jerusalem that really had any impact on whether or not Jerusalem was a major city in the 10th through early 9th centuries. Then there were additional excavations that took place. So that's that structure I just showed you a second ago. And there were additional excavations up here that were undertaken by another archaeologist who recently passed, Eilat Mazar. And if you look at this big map, there's the structure. Here are other areas that people had already excavated. So all of these have been excavated. And this is highly political, by the way, because most of this is under Palestinian neighborhoods. So talk about politics, you're right in the middle of it. And Mazar was excavating up here. And she claimed that she found this building that she dated to the time of David. And she said, aha, here's evidence of David's palace. But the problem was, there's all sorts of reasons you can't just date a structure without having really good dirt layers. Like, I want to have layers that close off the material culture underneath before I have the next period of material culture form above it. And sometimes people use a structure after it goes out of use, like, you know, you throw your old stuff into an abandoned building. And if I can't associate material culture with the floor of a building, then how do I know it just didn't accumulate there willy-nilly rather than being part of the creation of the building? So there was a huge fight over this, but really the centrality, is Jerusalem a capital city over David's kingdom or not, comes down to very little evidence, which is a problem. So we're not going to solve that. But I wanted to ask you, back to 2 Samuel, back to the text, to think about, if you were proving the archaeology, if it was supposed to show that these things happened, what does it actually tell us that we could look for? Most of 2 Samuel are these really sordid stories about David failing as a father figure and often failing as a king. We've got lots of information about David's interaction with his sons and his daughters and coups, but where do we really have anything we could actually excavate? And if we have cities that we can date to the right period, if we wanted to say that was true, would that prove they were a state? Would that prove they were connected? Or do we just have cities rising that are each, important? How would we find evidence of cooperation? So those are the problems. And I don't have solutions for them, other than to say that I think we have to take the Bible on its own terms. Using the Bible as if it's just going to give us, you know, a rundown of history is always a mistake, because the Bible is so much more than that. All right, so how much did I completely confuse you? Do you feel okay about it? Do you at least have a better sense of why scholars are still fighting 20 and 30 years later about this problem?
I have a question with regard to in modern Jerusalem,
Yeah,
the excavation site that is being called the City of David.
yeah.
Is that a political term yeah? I mean, and the other piece of this is, you know, when Jody Magnus talks about this, she seems pretty clear that that little strip of land south of the Temple Mount is the City of David.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, essentially, yes, and all the yeses. So number one, the material culture from that part of Jerusalem goes all the way back to the Neolithic and early Bronze. So the biggest structures are very early. We have a lot of material there from the Judahite kingdom, so the divided monarchy, and that's my area of expertise. And my book is about Jerusalem in most ways. So it is, the Ir David is that part of the city. It is in fact what they say it is. Here's where it gets dodgy though. Excavating is a choice, and it's an ethical choice. So just because we know that the City of David is there, and that if we excavate, we will find interesting things. And really, it's a much more important site in the 8th through 6th century. So after the period we were just talking about. So even if we know that, we can still choose not to dig it, right? If you know that excavating there has negative implications for modern inhabitants, you have a choice to make. Do you lose the data that helps you understand the history? Or what if excavations are being used even against the wishes of the excavator for modern political outcomes? What do? And that's what makes the City of David a really interesting ethical case study in archaeology. So there's no question that it has deep historical import, but it's also been used by settler organizations to displace Palestinians from Silwan. I don't think I'm saying anything controversial there. That's just descriptive. What do? Right? And this happens in all countries all over the world. So, you know, if I have a Native American burial ground not far from, you know, the University of Tennessee, but the Native Americans we work with as partners don't want it excavated, yet there would be scientific value and historical value in excavating it. Now you have to balance. Do you excavate? Do you not excavate? Right? What do? So I use this a lot with my students to talk about the ethics of archaeology. And it's never easy. Not anywhere in the world is it easy.
I think that's what you, I think you may have answered it. I was going to ask, would the nation of Israel use that, an archaeological dig, as an excuse to remove the Palestinians from that parcel of land?
So the only thing I would complicate in the question is the nation of Israel piece, right? So Israel's not monolithic. You have all sorts of different groups. So the number one group right now leading what they call alternative tours of the City of David, showcasing the impact of archaeology on Palestine, is also Israeli. So Israel has as many perspectives as the US does on these issues of occupation. So, you know, we might say, well, would the governor or would the mayor of Jerusalem do it versus would this party in the Knesset or that party in the Knesset? And I think what you end up with in Israel is, as in the US, a wide variety of opinions about who would use which historical narratives for what purposes. But I always try and, you know, some of the most liberal people I know that I'm friends with are Israeli, and some of the most conservative people I'm friends with are American and Israeli, right? Like, so just like any other country, there's a million views of what should happen. Yes, there are entities that would that are fine with saying this is a historical justification for ownership of this land, different from what is there now. But there are also tons of Israeli organizations that say it's not. So that's just my only way of kind of complicating that a little bit. It's political, but again, not only in Israel. There's a site in India that Hindu tradition was a Hindu temple upon which was built a mosque. And there were violent eruptions over whether to take down the mosque to dig the hypothetical Hindu temple or not. And, lots and lots of people died. So this is a problem with archaeology all over the world. And this is a very acute example of an Israeli adaptation. But, the site of Petra in Jordan, right? 1 second, let me. Madeline, stop talking now. Sorry, guys, my daughter is here too. So in the case of Jordan, having Bedouin who lived in Petra and then making Petra a UNESCO heritage site meant that the Jordanian government had to move the Bedouin out of their home and build a village where they would live. But the village isn't big enough. So as an archaeologist, if I dig in Petra, where am I ethically complicit? If my permit comes from Jordan, the Department of Antiquities, but the Department of Antiquities are doing things that the Bedouin population perceive as negative, where do I fit in the middle, right? So it's just so hard. Archaeology is so complicated. And, in the US, above all, right, between Native Americans and universities and excavating Indian and Native American burial grounds and appropriately holding on to those artifacts that are still not NAGPRA compliant even today, right? This is, right now in Canada, do you excavate Native American graveyards for children from Canadian schools? Do you not? If you do, how do you do it? What are the ethics of that? Who gives you the permit to do it? It's a mess, y'all. It's hard.
Have we lost our sound?
Okay, we're
I
back.
thought I heard. There you go. You're good.
We've obviously just scratched the surface, so to speak, to use your analogy. But this has been fascinating, and obviously there's a lot more to do. If you could just give us a short teaser in your perspective, what right now going on in Jerusalem or in the environs of Israel-Palestine is the most
Right.
exciting thing that's happening right now?
You mean in the archaeology world?
Yeah.
Jeez. That's hard. Never ask an archaeologist that, right? We're excited to find little bits of pottery. I'm really my favorite thing to find is a toilet, right? Because you get to have all sorts of scientific investigations about people's diet and daily life. To be honest with you, I do think Jody Magnus's excavations up at Hukok are astounding. That synagogue floor hasn't, one like that hasn't been excavated in decades. And the content of her mosaic floor will have an impressive impact on how we write the history of Jewish approaches to iconography and art, how biblical stories were reinterpreted by the Jewish community, how they were depicted. It's a pretty amazing site. Some people would say, well, there was just recently some excavations under Jerusalem that may relate to the Second Temple. And, those are hard for me because of the same reasons we were just talking about. Jerusalem archaeology is politically fraught. And so I always feel both excited about the finds and concerned about what the implications are going to be for the modern people who live there, both Jew and non-Jew alike. So that's a much hyped find in the news right now, but maybe for me it's more complicated than that. There's some really amazing early Christian discoveries over the last, say, 2 or 3 years related to the way the military spread Christianity outside of Megiddo. So some of that material is really interesting. And to me, because I excavate a Roman fort in Jordan where we've got an early 4th century church in the middle of the fort. So things that fill in the story of the spread of Christianity that aren't just, well, people liked Christianity, so they became Christian, but ways to figure out how institutions and organizations contributed to the spread of religion is super exciting to me. So there's some really great early Christian archaeology happening in Jerusalem, or not in Jerusalem, but in the environs outside, that I think is pretty spectacular. There's quite a lot of publication now about excavations that have gone on for a long time at Philistine sites. And Philistine sites are cool because they're one of the best sources of information about the period before the one we were talking about in the Iron One. Yeah, it's a bad question to ask an archaeologist.
One final, we have one other question here. One final question I have is, if folks ever wanted to do a visit that wasn't necessarily a pilgrimage per se, but more educational and archaeologically based, do you have resources for that? And then I'll hand over the final question.
Sure. So there are plenty of, a lot of tour companies that will take you to major sites. And those sites would depend on how you built the tour. So there are sites that are specific to, archaeological locations appropriate to the 1st century and later. So, things associated with the time of Jesus or the early church. You can find any number of travel companies that will cater to particular historical interests. And in Israel, there's a process for becoming a tour guide. So there are criteria you're supposed to pass to be able to take and give information. That having been said, as an archaeologist, I still probably dispute some of what tour guides say. So I like to sit at a Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls are found, or at Masada, and just listen to what versions of the stories of history I hear being told to tour groups. So I think your standard experience with most tours is going to be fine. I just think if you're really interested in a closer look at how archaeologists interpret the remains in front of you, and you want someone to be really honest about what we know, what we don't know, what's up in the air, and then contacting either me, which is totally fine, you're always welcome to write me, or another academic organization like UCLA or UC Berkeley or anybody in the California system, and just saying, who do you work with, right? Do you have suggestions about tour companies that you've collaborated with? I haven't taken students to Israel as a group because up until recently, the State Department rating on Israel prevented some universities like mine from allowing students to travel as groups. So the process of, I've taken students individually, and so then I say, well, come with me, right? And I'll take you and we'll talk about it. It can be difficult to find a travel organization or company that gives you maybe all the skinny on the complicated interpretation of sites, but I do have colleagues who are good at that. So if anyone's traveling in the region and just want some names of companies and tour guides that do a good job, in my opinion, as a boring scholar, I'd be glad to share those.
I have a question that might seem a little off, but it's related. I was watching a TED talk with Ron Eglish, who's a mathematician, who talks about iterations, and I guess you would call it, well, anyway, it's patterns in nature. And what he was saying is like a shape will repeat repeatedly to create something. But he's also saying it evolves in social systems as well. Mm-hmm. And I was listening to the talk and I was thinking about the spread of Christianity. And my question is there any evidence to suggest that there were patterns related to the spread of Christianity that would be repeated?
And by patterns, according to this, so when you say spread, my mind immediately goes to like, who's taking the information? How is it, where is it going, right? What's the mechanisms or delivery of delivery?
Yeah, the mechanisms and the geographical. aspect of it?
Sure. So one of the most interesting things about Christianity, to my mind anyway, is that like ground zero Christianity. So let's say 20 years after the death of Jesus, you've got all of these people wandering around talking about Jesus that don't agree with each other. So even the Bible represents Paul as disagreeing with Peter and the disciples. And of course, the funny thing is that Paul never met Jesus, right? So Paul's got this problem where he's asking people to trust him about a guy he never walked with, except the people that did hypothetically walk with Jesus are disagreeing with Paul on some important theological doctrine about how do you convert to Christianity. I love that period, right? Because there's not yet an authority that's forcing everyone into one doctrinal statement. And so what I find about most of my Christian students is Christianity doesn't take the texts between the New Testament and the modern period and put them into a book everyone reads, as opposed to Judaism, right? Judaism has the Hebrew Bible, but then it has the Mishnah, which are rabbinic thoughts about the Hebrew Bible. And then you get the Talmuds that are commentaries on the Mishnah. And all of these things are things that you read. But in Christianity, many of my students don't realize that there's the same process of interpretation and transmission. It's just, you Christians aren't getting ready together and reading like the letter of St. Clements or somebody, right? They maybe know about Augustine, but most Christian churches are not having, Christian group readings of Augustine's theological thoughts. So I say that because the process between getting from the 1st century, when Jesus is walking around, and the 4th century, when you begin to have ecumenical councils that are in a way imposing uniformity on what it means to believe as a Christian, and then excommunicating Christians who don't conform with those. That's a really interesting period of history, right? You've got this multiplicity. Christianity isn't yet associated with an empire, so it's not the religion of the powerful yet, which it will be, which is a key part in its spread, right? Once the empire becomes Christian, it's a lot easier to spread Christianity, just like if the empire was any other tradition, right? Like Islam. So that 200 or 300 years in there, I think, is really interesting in terms of patterns in the development. And I think that the story that most people don't get, and that's typical, you sort of hear, well, Constantine saw a vision in the sky, he became Christian, and that was the end of it. That's much more complicated. That's a whole nother topic on another day than that. But you also have the military that plays an incredibly important role in the spread of Christianity. And Christianity starts off as a Jewish tradition, one of many Jewish traditions. And then as it accumulates additional non-Jewish members, eventually is understood as its own thing, not just a sect of Judaism. And so you have more and more what we might call pagan, I don't like that language, but that's how people used to talk about it, non-Jewish, sort of polytheistic Roman imperial members of Christianity. And it's spreading through the military alongside other Eastern religious traditions like Mithraism. So as the military moves, you see Christianity move, which is why you have these early Christian mosaics at military sites in Israel. That's why in the 4th century, over in a military fort in Jordan, I've got a fully functioning, standing Christian church, little baby church. I like to think of it as a churchlet. So you have the movement of peoples and organizations and institutions, which, yes, Christianity is also spreading among the elite, and they're meeting in catacombs and all of that's happening. But you also have organizations like the military that are adopting Christianity in the East and spreading where the military goes. So I think it's such an interesting period of history. It's so much more complicated. And ultimately, we know our own lives are complicated, right? We know that we don't like to be generalized about. We know all of these things about our own, either our faith tradition or our lifestyle. And yet when we write the history of things, we write in these general terms as if it was easy or monolithic. And we can, I think, assume that ancient humans were just as complicated as we are, right? So I think sometimes when we talk about these things, we make a mistake, and the distance makes it look easier than it actually is. So to your question about patterns, I think what I'm looking for when I'm studying ancient religion is, where are the institutions, where are the humans, where's the movement, what's the infrastructure that's allowing rituals or beliefs or traditions to be circulated.
Erin, we're out of time, unfortunately. This has been wonderful. We thank you so much. We can show our thanks for you.
Sorry about my daughter coming in during COVID. Everything's a little crazy.
That's okay. And hopefully we can connect again sometime
Yeah.
in the future. So again, thank you so much. We're so pleased that you were with us today. Bye, everybody. Next week, by the way, we are having a class. I'll be leading a class on what we see about David and 2 Samuel in other parts of the Bible. So we'll be looking at that. And then the final week, we're going to have Steve McKenzie here with his book, David, a Biography. And he'll be closing out our sessions on David and 2 Samuel. So again, Erin, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being
Sure.
here. And we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. So long.